Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji. Welcome back to the Deconstructed Woman podcast. So over the last week, I was at a conference and I was telling Joji that one of the presentations was on the topic of vicarious trauma. And I think for a lot of people, when we hear this term, we think of people in the mental health realm or first responders or people who deal with pretty serious trauma or serious events, or hear stories of it out in the world. And so the definition that they presented was the emotional residue of exposure to traumatic stories and experiences of others through work, witnessing fear, pain, and terror that others have experienced, or preoccupation with horrific stories told to the professional. So I was saying that I do think that this obviously does help happen in the mental health realm. But I think in like today's environment and society, we hear a lot about war in other countries. We hear about school shootings, like that we get a lot of exposure to other traumatic events that other people are experiencing. But over time, I think that that kind of starts to wear down on you and starts to impact your ability to kind of relate to the world around you. So I think that's kind of where we're going to start and kind of talk about that. I can kind of speak to some of what the presenters talked about as some of the side effects of this, but I think that we all kind of experience it in different ways. So Joji, I wanted to turn it over to you as far as what are some things that come to mind when you first hear this.
Well, because we both share a background in mental health, obviously, as a mental health counselor, we actually get training as a way to create a boundary or a certain way of interacting with hearing people's stories so that we don't let that affect us and our judgment in the work that we're doing. But I will say that as a person who did it for many years, I started as I noticed as I got older and I had more and more of these stories in my head, it was difficult to be able to separate myself from them. And actually, it was when I got away from it that I realized that I was pretty thin skinned to it. It's almost like when I was doing that work continuously, that wall was there. But then when I got away from it, it's almost like that wall crumbled and I wasn't able to separate that. So the images and the matter of fact, it was something I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before that there just became a point where like the show SVU, like the Sexual Victims Unit, like I just couldn't watch that show anymore because it felt like I knew a patient who had this experience happen. And it just came to a point where I really couldn't bear to watch it anymore because it became too emotionally laden for me. And I had been away from doing counseling for many years at that point. And so yeah, I think that as long as you have those pieces in place, or maybe as you're doing it, and there's a certain kind of professional boundary that you put, I do feel like you can protect yourself to some extent. I guess my question would be whether that is you're able to keep that up, like for the therapists who then, do that kind of work for their whole careers. Is that something that doesn't, affect your personal life at all? What do you think about that, Alyssa?
Well, I think of a lot of the things that were discussed in this presentation kind of hit home for me because I think the first step is awareness. And so if you're not aware of it, you kind of like your norm of how you view the world is just kind of that's what it is. But I was looking at some of the side effects. And so, we were just talking about like parenting and things like that in the last in a couple of episodes behind this one. But one of the things that it said was that sometimes, like, there's change in parenting style. You become more overprotective as a side effect of, kind of hearing negative things day in and day out. And I thought that was such an interesting thing that I didn't really think about. A lot of times people say, oh, you're such a helicopter parent. But it's like, well, part of that is because if you work in a system like the criminal justice system or the medical system or somewhere where you're hearing a lot of these negative things, or I think even if you're just watching television and watching the news repeatedly, and I think we both agreed that like I don't watch the news anymore. I do get kind of main headlines sent to my inbox every morning, but for the most part, I don't watch the news because I don't really see a lot of positive things coming out of it. I just see so much negative. This shooting or this, child was kidnapped or abducted or what. I just feel like there's a lot of negativity out there, and no fault of the news media, but that's kind of what sells in a lot of ways. And so I've distanced myself from that, but I didn't think about how that impacts my parenting style. They talked about, obviously, like there's the cognitive aspects of maybe being more pessimistic or, not having as much like emotional connection to people. So to answer your question, I do think that it impacts people long term, but they may not equate it with that. And that was something that I took away from it was that I didn't think about my parenting style being affected, but in some ways that makes sense. And so there was a couple other things. Distrust and problems in relationships was another area that they said may be part of this. So again, there's probably a lot of side effects, and I mean, I can go into all of them, but I think there's also physical side effects, and those are things that like they talk about weakened immune system, reduced physical activity, and somatic reactions. So again, there's a lot of ways in which us kind of taking in that negativity can affect us in our thinking, how we act, and how we feel. And we don't always equate that to that.
I agree 100%. I mean, I feel like I think it could also go either way. I think as a parent, you could become overprotective, or you might even become a little bit more callous and not be reactive because you know people who've had it much worse, or something like that. Like, I feel like it could go either way depending on the nature of the stories that you're involved with and how it impacts you. I think that there are, stories that our parents tell us about their experiences or if they've been traumatized in some way or they had an experience that left an impression on them. And then that is something that affects us. I don't think this was a bad example. I remember my dad told me once but it worked, I'll say that. My dad told me that when he was in the Air Force and when he had to, in India, and when he had to do like, like overnight guard duty or whatever, that one of his friends offered him some drug to take to keep him awake. And he said it was the longest, like 12 hours of his life. Like he had a really negative reaction to it. He was scared and sounded like he was on something. It almost sounded based on his side effects, something like a amphetamine or like an angel dust kind of a thing. He was having all sorts of weird um, experiences, out of body experiences, things like that. And so that scared me so much because my dad was somebody I really looked up to. I always thought of him as a really strong man. And for like this in my mind, what was like this pill or whatever he took to really unravel him the way that it did, I just never was tempted to do any kind of drug use. Like it was just something that from a very young I was probably, like, under the age of 10 when my dad is telling me this, and I was, like, so frightened by his experience and how frightened he was reliving that experience that there was no doubt in my mind that I would never, take any kind of medication that I wasn't sure what it was for or why I was using it. And so I sort of feel like that was, like, a good experience. I mean, ultimately it taught me a good lesson, but I feel like it was a secondhand experience that really impacted me, and even as an adult, I can almost have a visceral experience to my dad's fear about what those long hours were like because he was just waiting for it to exit his body. And so I do think that there's lots of different ways that it impacts you. And sometimes we don't even know all the different ways that things are happening to us and what it is that you know, we affects our decision. I was talking to a woman a couple weeks ago, and she and I had some similarities. And she said that when she grew up in Chicago, she lived in a really bad part of town. So bad in Chicago that her parents wouldn't let her go outside to play. So one of the things that she really missed growing up was sort of that playing outside after school, riding your bikes around with your friends, riding around the block, and maybe some of the things that we take for granted. And she said that when she became a parent, she wanted to live in a very safe neighborhood so her children would not have the same experience that she did. And ultimately, she ended up moving to she's a woman of color, and she ended up moving to a very like homogeneous Caucasian neighborhood. And her children really didn't like that experience. They felt like they stood out like a sore thumb. And so everything she was trying to accomplish in her mind, something that she didn't want her children to have to suffer through, actually sort of ended up backfiring on her. And so I do think that those kinds of decisions that we make coming from our own experiences or our family's experience definitely does influence some things that we don't even maybe realize until much later. And so I think that it can happen for sure. Can you do you think that that's too much of a diluted example of vicarious trauma, the way that you heard it in the conference, or do you think that it still counts in some fashion because some of the side effects might be there?
Yeah, I think some of the side effects might be the same for those examples that you're giving. I think that I mean, trauma in of itself hits everybody very differently. So again, two people might be watching the news and one, whatever the topic is, like, um, I'm trying to think of like one of the main things, like 9/11, for example. I mean, I think that was such a significant event in American history, but at the same time, it hit everybody very differently. Like some people, it hit, that were in New York City, like it hit them at their core. It was their city. For other people further away from the actual, the city, maybe across the country. I mean, I think that there was just a significant ripple effect that occurred, but everybody it hit differently. And so I think that if you, again, like two people seeing that, it's going to impact them in different ways based upon their own experiences, their own history, their relation to the events. And so I think that it's hard to identify or fully explain or label what exactly trauma is and how that can be vicarious. But I think essentially at its core, what we're talking about is just absorbing, and again, that said, like the residual effect, like absorbing that negativity and that, like the stress and all of those emotions from those experiences. Whether you experience, I mean, if you experience it yourself, it's trauma. If you experience somebody else's event and you weren't part of it, that's vicarious trauma. So that's the best way that I think of it. But as you were talking, I was thinking about even, kind of bringing some of our past episodes back. We talked about pruning friendships. And one of the things that it made me think of is, we talked about in a couple of different episodes, just, surrounding yourself with positive people. And why do we talk about that? Well, one of the reasons is because if you're constantly around people who are really negative or are always in crisis or they're always just kind of having this hard time. I mean, obviously, you don't want to just leave them high and dry, but that takes its toll on you after a while. I think that that can eventually make you, almost again, feel that experience, even though you're not in it, to feel that same experience. And so, eventually people tend to kind of distance themselves. And I think that that is a normal kind of reaction. Um, and why, if it's not to say that if you're going through a hard situation, you shouldn't lean on your village or the people around you. But I think that when it's just kind of over repeatedly happening, it's really hard for another person to kind of sit through that. And not have it impact them in some way.
Yeah. I was thinking while you were talking that I've met a lot of women who've been through some kind of a sexual trauma, and sometimes they're I mean, unless they work through some of that experience, the emotion, the fear, I have seen where their paradigm is sort of life view has sort of shifted. And before they do the work that they need to, they live every day in fear. And I also have seen in family counseling how sometimes the children feel like they that fear has been transferred to them and their parents are so overprotective, like you were saying, or their mom is so overprotective that they almost transfer that fear to their children, and their children don't know what to make of that because, they don't have the experience to understand it. They just respect their parents and they don't want to do anything that upsets them, but at the same time, they are being limited in their experience and their exposure. So, of course, this makes me think of what you were talking about before we started on, and I'm hoping that you can define it. Is called controlled empathy. And so I think controlled empathy has a role in the scenario that I'm talking about. But if you could define it again, and maybe I'll pick it back up again.
Sure. So controlled empathy, I mean, I'm going to go to their notes because um, I think that I know I get it because I think that I live it. But it's the constant monitoring of emotions so as not to react to stories and testimony, absorbing information without showing emotion. So this is something that, again, kind of hits for those in the mental health field who um, are kind of taught to not show emotion or to respond. I think um, first responders, police, firefighters, all of medical professionals, especially when I think of like people in the ER when somebody comes in and you can just tell that this is a life threatening situation, you are not supposed to respond because your fear on your face is going to translate to that person's fear. Like they are going to be maybe more combative or more fearful. And so you have to kind of go into the situation saying, everything's going to be okay. Like we're going to get you in there. It's going to be all right. Like I think of like, I don't work in the medical field, but this is like the best example that comes to my mind almost immediately. It's just that idea of if I know so many times like when I've gone to the ER because I'm having some situation and everyone's so calm and I appreciate that because it calms me down, but if they reacted the way that they feel, I imagine that reaction would be pretty significant. And so it's kind of this dulling of the emotional response to things around you. And what that does is what they describe is that that kind of shuts down the right side of your brain after a while. And that can impact you in other areas such as creativity and love and intimacy and things like that um, that are impacted by the right side of your brain. And I'm not a neurologist or anything like that. So I don't mean to like spout off a bunch of like left side, right side brain information, but that side of your brain is impacted by that. So again, like the left side of your brain is more logical. Oh yeah, more logical, more strategic, analytic, and your right side is more of like empathy, love, compassion, innovation, passion. I'm just reading off of what they have, like art, creativity. So again, if you're thinking about like how that translates, that can hit people in a lot of different ways. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does. And one thing that, as you were talking about that, it made me think about was I think that when you're in a if you're an emergency room doctor, nurse, or you work in, labor and delivery, I mean, there's always things where you have to react and you don't have time to think. Firefighters, same way, ambulance drivers, the same way. I think you're trained to respond in the moment to the situation that's in front of you. And one of the things that I learned about myself is that I'm really, really good in an emergency situation, whatever that emergency situation is. I'm very good at flipping into active mode and doing what I have to do. But I will tell you that 4 hours after the event, 12 hours after the event, it's almost like something happens And what I found historically would happen to me is after a long period of stress, whatever that was, then my body would give out. And I just had lots of somatic issues. Like there was times where like patches of my hair would fall out or um, those kinds of things would happen. And it would be like, oh, well, why did this happen? And it seemed like it was so far away from the event. And my doctors would always ask me, like, have you been through a significant stress, event? And I'm like, "Oh, well, that happened like a week ago or something." But it's almost like your body tolerates a certain amount of stress or, this kind of baggage that we have that accumulates. And you'd also touched upon burnout and how, well, this can also add up to burnout. And some of the part of the purpose of this conference was to alert individuals who do this kind of work to be mindful of the fact that, you have to pay attention. You have to be aware of the side effects so that you can manage yourself because otherwise the work will cripple your ability to do work. And so I do think that that's something that is also important. I think the other thought I wanted to share too is that for many of us who have had anxiety, and I think that when you first become a parent, I think when you have a baby and you're fully responsible for the life of this child and the safety of this child, there are memories that I have of sometimes just being paralyzed with fear about, just normal things. Like I remember, my husband and I having a disagreement about should, my daughter walk to school by herself, and is that sort of like a badge of honor, like she can walk, at what age can she walk? And then you think about all the things that can go wrong, even though we only live 3 blocks from school. And and so I do feel like part of what I wanted to express is that as parents, and this the first thing I think about is as a parent, you have to overcome that fear to be able to let your child have a normal experience, right? And I think I've heard a lot of people who have phobias, one of the ways that they talk themselves down is to be able to say, to talk themselves through doing the thing that they fear the most. Because if you give into the fear, it just gets bigger and bigger. And so I do feel like even though maybe it's just a mild connection. I do think that anxiety can also, how wherever the origin of your anxiety is, if you allow it to get out of control, it will limit your daily activities. And so you sort of have to find a way to manage it, control it, sort of this controlled empathy, not exactly, but a little bit. It's a different way of saying that you have to be able to contain whatever visceral experience you're having to that anxiety to be able to get through your day. And that's how people who have anxiety disorders make it through their day, is to be able to contain it in some fashion so that it doesn't prevent them from doing what they have to do. Do you think that's a stretch, Alyssa? Do you think that I'm trying to generalize some of these concepts to people who are not in the medical field or not in mental health or not, firefighters or things, because I think there are other examples. I think there's a lot of PTSD people, whether it's war related PTSD, it's, a car accident or something that you've had a traumatic injury that you have to now relearn how to walk or talk or relearn how to speak. I mean, those things can be very, very traumatic. And so I do feel like there's, some similarities. It's not exact. I'm not saying it's 100%, but I think there are some connections that other people who have no connection to mental health or these kinds of very difficult jobs might be able to relate to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the example of anxiety comes to mind. Like that's what you were talking on, and I think that that's even people with social anxiety and um, you know anxiety or social anxiety or something like that. The way that I view that is, you have to kind of put on a face. So if you have to, this reminds me because I have a lot of friends who are introverts, quite a few, and so but they have kids, and so they put on social events like birthday parties for their kids. But we kind of all laugh like afterwards, like, oh man, we need to go and recoup and recover. And I was saying like I need always kind of to recover from social situations. Like I'm fine in them, but I also feel like I need to kind of rest and recover, if you will. And so I was thinking of that kind of situation where maybe you're in a social situation and you can't respond the way that you want to because you're, internally feeling all of these emotions, but you have to stay cool, calm, and collected, for example. And so by not being able to show your true emotions, I think that that takes its toll over time. And so I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about, but that's what comes to my mind as far as how this would relate to people who maybe can't show. I mean, I'm thinking that would relate to people like we've talked about women in high power positions and we've talked about how you can't seem emotional or overly sensitive because that might make you look weak and that would impact your ability to be taken seriously. I mean, I think that it fits in a lot of different ways. And that's just another example of how we may have to mask how we're feeling in that moment in order to be taken seriously, even though that, if you do that repeatedly over and over again, it's actually impacting your ability to feel those emotions later on. So I think that it is something that definitely translates and kind of, there's a vein of it throughout a lot of our episodes that we've talked about. Um, from like the queen bee, I'm just like connecting. I'm sitting here like, oh, all of my neurons are firing because I'm connecting all of these episodes that we've done and talked about. But again, I think that there's a lot there that can be said. And so I think that hopefully what we're getting at is that this should impact or touch most people who are listening to this podcast. That in some ways, even if you don't listen to other people's trauma, and you're like, nope, that's not what I have to do. Maybe the news influences you. Maybe, your friends influence you. Maybe your job influences you. And the bottom line is that you need to just be aware of it. So, again, kind of going back to what I said earlier, awareness of this is the first step. And then just kind of finding balance and the ability to counteract that. If you do find yourself being able to find spaces where you can truly be authentic in yourself and giving your brain the ability to decompress from those types of situations. And then I think, really kind of connecting with other people and making sure that those connections are um, positive ones that help you through. I think all of that is really kind of the next steps once you've kind of identified, yeah, this might be an area. I mean, I always encourage people, I think we both do, to, look into this, see if this is something that impacts you, but then also, if you find that it is really impacting you, mental health field, finding somebody to talk to about it, processing it, that's the route to go because that's really the only way that you can, I wouldn't say the only way, but it's one of the main ways that you can try to kind of manage that on a daily basis.
And I think the last thing I'll say too is that as women, we know that we are taking care of so many things and so many people that we deplete ourselves. And what I heard you say, Alyssa, was when you need that time to recharge if you've been in an exhausting social situation, and if you tend to be more of an introvert, then you need to, sort of recharge. And I think that's true for every single person. And I think those of us being women who are just naturally, even if you don't have very many commitments, we're still probably working harder than the average individual, because we are caretaking, whether it's at home or work or, a lot of different places. It just seems to be something that we do. And so, as a way to recharge, you have to give yourself permission to do that. Most of us know that we are, stretched thin, and we know that we make have to make time even when that time is not readily available. I think that's a theme in these conversations, that we're just really giving people permission to take care of themselves, whatever that looks like in your own life, whether it's exercise, meditation, whether it's social activity, hanging out with your friends, taking some time off, having, a coffee date for yourself, whatever your self-care looks like. It's something, but the guaranteed issue is that you will burn out. You will not have anything to give to anybody in a lifestyle where you are always giving more than you're getting. And if you don't make time for yourself, that's really going to hurt you in the long run, whether it affects your body, your mind, or your relationships. It will take a toll on some part of your life. So just a reminder to take care of yourself. And as we think about, we are the most important tool that keeps the glue in our life together and for so many people. So you have to take care of yourself. Melissa, if you don't have anything else to say, do you mind closing us out?
Sure. So if you have taken something away from this podcast, please feel free to let us know by sending us a voice message. We can, anywhere that you listen to this, you can leave us a star review letting us know that you enjoyed this episode or past episodes. You're welcome to join us in our Facebook page, the Deconstructed Woman Podcast. We post our episodes each week, as well as we're trying to increase the posts that we put out. Just talking about, like, the other day was Women Appreciation Day and different things like that, and really continue the conversation in a social platform. And you can always email us at the deconstructedwomanpodcast@gmail.com. So feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what your thoughts are, or how you've been impacted by this. We would love to hear from you. And we look forward to having the next conversation on our next episode.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.